This is a true story, ladies and gentlemen. This is the strange story of an innocent and beautiful cartridge, once endeared to the hearts of many, that now lies abandoned, dying, and all but forsaken in the ever-dimming memory of time. But this is not the story of a natural death, not at all. This is the story of a careless, thoughtless, callous mistreatment. This is the story of malevolence, cruelty, and injustice. This is the story of a calculated, timed, and systematic conspiracy to wipe its memory from the face of time. Who could have done this? What possibly was the motive? And what did they seek to gain? When did this tragedy happen? And where did it happen? Why was this allowed to happen? And how could such a thing have ever occurred? But this is a story that has not yet ended. This is the true story of what many consider the most perfect rifle of all time. This is the story of the 257 Roberts. Welcome back. You know, it's no secret whatsoever that the late, great Jack O'Connor was the big proponent of the 270 Winchester. His writings propelled the 270 into American fame, and basically he was the one who immortalized the 270. Now, very few people probably understand or recall that he was also a great proponent of the 257 Roberts. Let me read something he wrote about the 257 Roberts in this book that he authored in 1942. This is the Outdoor Life Cyclopedia. He was the editor of Outdoor Life for a great number of years. Since 1934, the 257 Roberts cartridge has been available from all the big loading companies, and rifles have been made by both Winchester and Remington. But for some reason, the 257 has remained almost entirely a gun fan's rifle. Paradoxically, the majority of those who own this great all-round rifle have several others in the rack, and the men who need it haven't given it much consideration. Paradoxically, too, this first-class deer cartridge was developed not as a big game caliber, but as a super-accurate, long-range woodchuck cartridge. Originally a crossbreed between the 7mm case and 25 caliber bullets, the 257 shines in a half dozen fields, and the man who owns one and who knows how to use it is pretty well fixed up for almost any sort of hunting. One of the favorite dreams of the average American hunter and rifleman is of an all-round rifle, one that he can use for everything from cottontails to deer. Many hunters have the notion that if they shoot one rifle all the time, instead of using several, they might learn to be pretty deadly with that one. And there is something in that notion. So that's what Jack O'Connor wrote about the 257 Roberts in 1942. You could see that between the lines he was already witnessing to the fact that the 257 was barely being acknowledged by the people who should have taken note of it. It was a marksman's rifle. It was a rifle that was owned by those who loved accuracy. It was a rifle that was owned by the aficionado, the person who had, like he said, a rack full of rifles, and they wanted to make sure they had one of the greats, and they had a 257. The person who originated the 257 Roberts was Ned H. Roberts. He was born right in Gorham, New Hampshire, just about an hour north of me, and he's buried in Goffstown, New Hampshire, which is in the Manchester area, and he was a very, very dedicated enthusiast and also writer. He wrote he wrote extensively about black powder rifles. He spanned the era that changed from black powder to smokeless powder, and he always wrote about the black powder rifle, the Schutzen rifles, and his writings still endure and are sought by people who are involved with competition black powder rifle shooting. But his big interest in the 20s was to develop a very accurate long-range cartridge, and this was amidst all the super accurate 22 cartridges that existed at the time, the centerfire cartridges, and believe me, there were a bunch of experimentations going on with centerfire 22s, high velocity ones, long range, and everything else. But he recognized that heavy bullets were sometimes far better equipped at bucking wind, and that there were better ballistic coefficients to be had if he upped the bore size to 25 caliber. So in his development, he picked the 7mm Mauser case, which was the ideal case capacity, he figured, for bringing that engine up to full capacity, full power for the bore diameter. And if you've seen some of my other videos, you know that there is such a thing I've spoken about of bore to chamber ratio. In other words, the bore to the boiler room capacity is something which is very important. Bores that have the correct amount of powder achieve the best ratio of velocity to powder capacity, and there is a certain point where they exceed that, and the term is overbore. Overbore is basically too much powder to burn in a given barrel diameter, and they become very inefficient, which basically means that the barrel length has to become longer and longer in order to give time for the burning of the powder. And the types of powder which has to be used in that circumstance has to be slow burning. Powders like H40, 831, and IMR 4350, and powders of that sort that have to have more time to burn and thus much more barrel length. But he wanted to have a very efficient and accurate cartridge that would burn well. At the time, there had already been a lot of experimentations done, and there was wildcatting done with the 2506, different names that were basically being used for that necking down of the 3006 cartridge case. But he felt that that was an overbore situation, and so he used instead the 7mm Mauser case, which he knew first of all was essentially the 3006 cartridge case. That was the 3006 cartridge case. If you saw my video about the 7mm Mauser, is basically a lengthened 7mm Mauser case, which the United States adopted from the German design. But he took the 7mm Mauser case as a better case capacity for the bore diameter, for 25 caliber bore diameter. And thus his experimentations yielded one of the most accurate cartridges that ever existed in that day. And it still remains, you know, all things are relative, all things move at the same rate. So as all rifles became more accurate, also the 257 Roberts maintained its position in the pack. And it's still an extremely efficient and accurate cartridge. I was very, very blessed to have known a gentleman back a number of years ago who passed away 20 years ago, who knew Ned Roberts, and who on occasion went out during his testing forays out in his back pasture where he did a lot of test shooting. And he knew Mr. Roberts for quite a number of years before he died, and he was a very dedicated experimenter. And this is back in the day when you didn't have all the luxuries that you have now. I mean, everything in those days that somebody had to build it on his own. They didn't have you didn't just simply go to the store and buy a bench rest, you know, with a tripod, legs, and everything was handcrafted and engineered and machined on its own merit and by the person who needed it. So it was a very interesting time. But his original concoction of the 257 Roberts was nothing like the 1934 release by Remington. His adoption of the 257 Roberts basically gave it far more velocity than what was then the most popular 25 caliber, the 250 Savage, or then called the 250-3000 Savage. The 250-3000 Savage was driving an 87 grain bullet at 3,000 feet per second. But Ned Roberts' 257 Roberts was besting that by 300 to 400 feet per second. Remington's release of it, however, really handicapped it and put hobbles on it. For whatever reason, they said that it was due to the extant 257 Roberts that were made out there that were, they said, weak and couldn't stand the pressure, and therefore they kept the pressure way down. Well, I don't know if that could possibly be any more true than the fact that there are weaker 30-06s out there and weaker everything. I mean, there are always, you know, in the world of rifles, there are always people who are going to have old, weak rifles, and it's basically it's up to everybody to understand that if their rifle is old and looks tired and it's showing signs of headspace problems or something, to take it out of service or have it repaired. But rather than simply acknowledging that, Remington, for whatever reason, hobbled it and took down the velocity and internal pressure so greatly that it basically made the 257 Roberts nothing more than a 250-3000 improved. It really only ran up the velocity another 100 feet per second over the 250 Savage. The only thing to its credit was that the 257 Roberts had a faster twist and therefore could use 117 and 120 grain bullets, whereas the 250 Savage simply could not. The 250 Savage had a slower twist of 1 in 12 twist generally, sometimes even a 1 in 14 twist, and it was woefully inadequate to shoot anything greater than a 100 grain bullet. But, you know, rather than having a cartridge that, you know, upped the velocity to modern levels, as they should have, Remington kept the velocities way down. So the 87 grain bullet loading was way down by 300 feet per second or so. The 100 grain bullet loading was held down by the same amount, and also the 117 and 120 grain bullets were also kept way down. They made a couple of other very bad engineering mistakes. The 120 grain or the 117 grain bullet was typically loaded with a round-nosed bullet that shed velocity very, very quickly. Very poor aerodynamic shape, and so it seemed to be a bad situation all around when it came to the ammunition. To make matters even worse, they engineered the first rifles with too short of a box magazine, and because of that, the rounds could not be seated fully out to the rifling, to near the rifling. So therefore, the rifles had a tremendous amount of free bore. The bullets were seated too deeply in the case, and there was excessive jump in the chamber to the rifling, and that also intruded upon powder capacity. You know, when a bullet is jammed too far down into the case, you have basically a cylinder that's occupying powder capacity and chamber space. So these were really bad things all around. I mean, the engineering could not have, if they had set down to conspire against the 257 Roberts, they couldn't have done a better job. Everything was against it. Winchester released the Model 70 their bolt action Model 70 with a long action and a long box magazine that could take advantage of the full-length chambering. And to this day, whenever Remington releases the 257 Roberts, they release it on a short action. And when Winchester releases it, as they did a few years ago, I happen to have one myself, they release it on the long action. Perhaps Winchester is well aware that the 257, being a hand loader's dream, is going to be hand loaded properly, and therefore they make the action and the box magazine what it ought to be from the beginning. I'm able, with my Winchester, I'm able to load them as they ought to be, with the bullet seated out properly and given the correct amount of jump to the rifling, which is only less than 30 thousandths of an inch. So this is the problem that the 257 Roberts started out with. And as Mr. O'Connor alluded to, it was suffering from lack of recognition by the very people who needed it the most, the so-called the people who needed to have an all-round rifle. An all-round rifle is what a lot of guys want to have. It was ideal for that. If they needed to have a rifle that could shoot long range at woodchucks or coyotes or whatever, jackrabbits, and then also have a rifle that they could bring into the woods with a heavy bullet, and one that they could use out in the prairie for long-range shots on antelope and mule deer. They couldn't have had a better rifle. The 257 Roberts with Barnes bullets, even back when I didn't complete this article, but even back then, Jack O'Connor recommended that for elk, 120 grain Barnes bullet would be the correct choice. So, and Jack O'Connor, believe me, he hunted game throughout the world. He knew rifles, and he knew what was necessary to take down big game. The popularity of the 257 Roberts then always was a little bit shaky. There were people who loved it and who purchased the rifles, but there were other people who just simply shunned it and ignored it because it was given such bad recognition by the press. The press recognized, that there were a lot of gun writers who talked trash about it because it was a cartridge that was not properly configured. It was a rifle that was not properly configured, and so forth and so on. And so they called it nothing more than the 250 Savage improved, and that sort of thing. So along came the 50s, and at that time, the Sports Afield editor, Warren Page, he was assisting in the development and engineering design of the 243 Winchester and the 308. He was one of the principal founders of those two cartridges, and he was a bench rest shooter, gun writer, and he had access to the industry, and he actually worked with Winchester in developing the 243. But for whatever reason, rather than simply promoting the 243 by its own merits, he took occasional side swipes at gave the 257 Roberts some body checks and compared them directly, which I think is always an unfair maneuver. I would never seek to, if I were given the position, I would never seek to undermine somebody else's achievement. Promote your own, but leave the other guy alone. He also has something worthwhile. But in any case, for whatever reason, whether he thought that the market could be expanded for the 243 by simply cutting the market down for the 257, one does not know, and I'm not seeking to judge him. But that was what occurred, and over time, and I know that Jack O'Connor and Townsend Whalen wrote extensively about the 257 Roberts, supporting the need for a cartridge like that. That it was a wonderful alternative for a person seeking to have a little bit better frontal area. The 243 succeeds in having very good sectional density, but naturally a 6mm bore is not a 25 caliber bore. You know, in all situations, a little bit greater frontal area gives you a little bit more tissue destruction, a more instantaneous killing and bloodletting. But if you think it has gotten bad up to that point, then by the mid-60s, Remington released the 2506 in all its glory. The 2506 had been around as a wildcat, a very successful wildcat, for a long time. The chamberings were, unlike so many other wildcats where the chamberings were inconsistent, the 2506 had achieved a pretty consistent chambering, which was adopted by Remington, and people who had those wildcat rifles that were custom made for them, handmade, could simply buy a box of 2506 off the shelf and load them. Everything was good to go. There were no short magazines. There was no underloading or anything. They were loaded up to full capacity. Well, if you take the full capacity of a 2506 and you measure it against the undercapacity of a 257 Roberts, there ends the story. It was an unfair advantage right off the bat. And from that point, very shortly after, Remington seemed to lose interest in commercializing the 257 Roberts. The loadings began to disappear from the market. The 87 grain bullet and the 100 grain bullet are now a matter of history. They're gone. What remains now is the 117 grain and 120 grain bullets as loaded by some of the companies now. You do have some increase in performance with the so-called plus P ammunition, which was introduced by Winchester in the 80s, with a thicker case head. Whether it needed it or not, I'm not sure, because I've never known of any Mauser style cases to be undersized or too thin to begin with. But for whatever reason, they thickened the case head, thickened the brass in the lower region, and therefore it lessened its internal case capacity, but it still allows it to have suitable capacity to run the pressures up. Now, I'm not going to impinge upon copyright laws by mentioning a particular reloading catalog by name, but one of the reloading catalogs that I have specifically states that in their testing, this is a powder company, that in their testing they found that the plus P numbers that they achieved, the internal pressure they got when they were testing the pressure, was way below what the so-called plus P pressure is regarded to be. So even now, the commercial cartridges, even though they have plus P on the stampings, it's quite possible, according to that laboratory, that powder manufacturer, it's quite possible that the powder is still not up to par in those cases and still way below potential. My own personal belief is that it has to stay that way, because the 257 Roberts, what I have found, in fact, there's legitimate loadings that are given in one of my manuals that comes directly from the powder source, right in the Lee manual, and it lists velocities which come within 70 feet per second of the 2506. So you can see that Ned Roberts was always right to begin with, that the 2506, being overbore, had reached its full capacity by the time it got to a 7mm case, and that stretching it by another 20% more powder simply didn't derive that much more velocity. The actual velocity that would derive from that increase should have only been, if all things were equal and the 257 Roberts was loaded to the capacity that it ought to have been loaded, really would have only been about a 7 to 8% increase in velocity, which which is really, you know, that might be meaningful to some people. Even if it's not at that level, I will say that even the loadings which are commercially produced now, the so-called plus P loadings with the 120 grain bullets, are only cataloging less than 200 feet per second below the 2506. Now that probably sounds like a lot of velocity, but that 200 feet per second actually achieves, over a course of 400 yards, only achieves about 1.2 inches in trajectory height. So over 400 yards, 1.2 inches in trajectory height does not seem that significant to put up with the additional muzzle blast and all the additional recoil, use of raw components, and also the erosion of the barrel. You know, it goes without saying that when you're pouring an additional percentage of powder like that, 10% more powder down the barrel under high pressure, the barrel length, I should say the barrel life, can be diminished significantly. And the 2506 is a very accurate cartridge. I'll do a piece about the 2506 in time. I've shot the 2506 extensively, and it's a superbly accurate cartridge. It doesn't have to apologize for its existence. The 2506 is an extremely good cartridge. It was a very good use of the 3006 cartridge case, as so many others are. But it is less efficient than the 257 Roberts, which achieves which should, by all rights, achieve nearly the same velocities with a lot less hubbub, without having quite so much recoil, a lot less muzzle blast, and all the other nice things that make shooting so much more fun. So I'm going to be showing you the 257 Roberts when I do my piece about the Model 70 Winchester. But for now, thank you for watching, and God bless.